think it might be a good idea for us to spend a minute reflecting that even here in this room where we'll be working together, that God is present with us, and ask God to be present with us as we continue our work through the 3 weeks ahead of us. So let us concentrate on that reality for a moment. Say John Baptist also. With Jesus in our hearts. First of all, I'd like to make sure that I know who you all are. So going down the list, I think I know who Brother Christopher Basson is. And Brother Francis Colgan, I think that's you. Who is Jack Curran? Dominic Fontaine is here in front of me. And Mrs. Kelly Gardner is over there. We're really happy to have you aboard, Mrs. Gardner. That was the easy part. Now, we're probably suffering from jet lag, so if you want to fall asleep this morning, this is the day to do it. Because we have to get over some pretty dull stuff, although this may wake you up. But I have to say that I think from the experience of past groups, those who have tried to keep up with the reading are the ones who have profited from the experience most. Fundamentally, most of the reading will consist in the great experience of reading through the first 3 books of Canon Blaine's biography of the founder. He was a contemporary of the founder, of course, and if you've never done that, it's an experience worth going through. It's especially good after you've been through it. It's a wonderful thing to have been through, and it's pretty painful while you're going through it, however. But Blain is interesting. When he wrote his biography, he had the notes and the reminiscences of the brothers right at his hand. He had some of the founders' own recollections right to hand. He can tell a marvelous story, but he's also very prone to moralizing and interpreting the works of Providence, which, of course, it's kind of fun because it's so uncharacteristic of our own time. So you have to learn how to speed read Blaine. I think, you've already got those big 3 thick volumes. And that's the essence of what we're going to do, is go through those. And so I strongly urge you to stay with the Blaine. We sometimes, Gus calls him Blaine and I call him Black. And you can call him anything you want, but which you probably will before very long. But I think it's the only way to really catch on to the founder in the beginning. Then, of course, that has to be interpreted, criticized, and balanced off by other much more contemporary research. Oh, the lost has been found. So that's very, very important to do the readings, and especially once we get into the Blaine. Now, to begin with, however, what we're going to do today is kind of get introduced to the sources. The very first year we did Buttimer, we did it at Manhattan College, and at that time one of the options was that you could take this course for graduate credit if you paid for it. As it turned out, nobody did. But we had to have the trappings of a kind of a scholarly sort of an approach to things. And so that's one reason that historically we developed a lot of material on the sources. On the other hand, as part of the Buttimer experience, you're all expected to do some kind of a project. So you have to have some familiarity of where all this stuff comes from, and how to go about it, and where to find things that you might need, depending on what aspect of De La Salle it is that you decide to work on. So before the morning's over, we'll have some acquaintance with that. And as I said last evening, towards the end of the morning, we'll all go over together to the Lasallian studies room over there and take a look at all of this material physically so you can see it and see where it's available and how to get at it. But you all already have a little bit of a library that's been provided for you, and I'll provide a little bit more. Institute a few years ago started this series called Lasallian. And all these pretty colored papers here are excerpts from Lasallian, which I'll pass around in a few minutes, all right? And so your first reading assignment is to start reading some of this stuff. And so that's the first point that I want to make, the importance of the readings. Now, just for your general guidance, let's go through this list. By the way, there's a back side to this page. So there's twice as much as appears at first. Let me sort of point out to you the pace that we're going to try to set here. Right? So tomorrow I want to do, we'll do just sources today. That's why I say if you're tired and want to fall asleep, go right ahead. Tomorrow we want to do something about the education and so the educational background into which the founder is born and begins to mature and get involved with the work of education. So we'll do most of that tomorrow, and most of these colored papers that are here have to do with that. Now, of course, that's the major work of the second year of the Buttimer, huh? But I think we have to have some background about what the educational system was like, because after all, the whole life of the founder centers around that, for one thing. And, well, also, we lose a few people after the first year of Buttimer, so you better have a little bit of an idea, even after Buttimer won, about this, the educational side of this thing. It's like years ago at Manhattan College, they used to require a course in moral theology of all the freshmen, with the idea that a lot of them quit school after freshman year, so they'd better know the 10 Commandments before they dropped out of college. And also how to apply the principle of double effect with a few other crazy things that were characteristic of the moral theology of that day. But that's another story. Don't let me get sidetracked. So I have some stuff here on the management of the schools, for example. That'd be nice if you could read some of this for tomorrow. And will also serve to introduce you to some of the European brothers who are doing a lot of work on the founder. This was put together by Brother Léon Laurère, who was the education secretary for the Institute for a while. He then went back to Paris, and now he's back in the Mother House, and he's going to be the new archivist at the Mother House. And, but here's an idea, for example, of the timetable for an ordinary week in the school. It's very concrete stuff. And then the sequence of courses in the elementary schools that the founder ran. So that'll give us some concrete idea of what the schools were like. It's kind of a commentary on the management. These two papers are by Brother Yves Poutet. Now, Yves Poutet is one of the foremost of the Lasallian scholars. Well, I'd rank him personally, I'd put him about third. As an historian and a scholar, he's very professional. But his interest is much more in French religious history than it is specifically in the Institute. He hasn't written as much or as extensively on the founder as somebody like Léon Loes, for example, but he's got an awful lot of good stuff that fills you in on a lot of the background of the founder's thing. And so this is this perennial problem about what kind of kids came to our schools. There's a couple of pages here on that. So that's Yves Poutet's stuff. And then all of this concerns the writings of the founder himself, which we want to get to before the morning's over. So, so that's what I'd like you to get through be finished with those pages when you come in here tomorrow, okay? And also read, read these pages that I have here in beginnings, because in case some of you don't happen to know where France is, or what it was like in the 17th century, or the kind of the population and the social situation, et cetera, my earliest effort in publishing Lasalliana was in this book, Beginnings, of which you all have a copy. And so there's a few pages there for you to read. Okay, so it would be nice if you could have read all of those pages in Beginnings and all of these pages that will be distributed shortly. Okay, so we're doing number 1 today. We'll do 2 and 3 tomorrow. Now, this is flexible because sometimes we get bogged down. Gus and I get in a fight between us over something, and then the first thing you know, we get out of sync. On Thursday, we'll try to do 4 and 5. On Friday, we'll do 6. All right, and that will take care of. So by Friday, by the time we finish on Friday, we hope to have John Baptist de La Salle meeting Adrian Niel for the first time. So that'll give you the weekend to get started on the blank. So you see you have, for Monday, we'll try to do 7. So in blank, that means that you will already finish the first volume of blank for Friday and get started on the first 64 pages of the second. Then we'll do 8 on Tuesday. That's Tuesday, July 2nd. So Monday, July 1st is 7. Tuesday is 8. Wednesday, we'll do 9 and 10. Thursday is the 4th of July. Friday, we'll do 11 and 12. Then Monday, the 8th, we'll do 13 and 13. Tuesday, the 9th, we'll do 14 and 15. And Wednesday, the 10th, we'll do 16 and 17. Okay. So the readings are a little bit light in the beginning, so it's good to try to get ahead of time. And it's you'll get a lot more out of the presentation if you have read the stuff that I'm going to talk about. In a certain sense, I'm going to try to presume that you've read the material assigned for a given day as we approach each of these topics. Is that enough to let you see what's ahead of you? Yes, please.
I don't know if this question is apropos or not, but I was wondering if by accident or design, there's absolutely no reference to Claire Battersby, who about 35 years ago had a book on the founder, and I don't know this. And also, I think he has a number of other books. And 1 or 2 well-chosen sentences, could you sort of indicate the value of his effort?
We'll come to that. The Baltimore brothers must surely remember Benny Leonard, Eliseus Leonard. And when we were graduate students at De La Salle, the Washington Scholastica, he was our pro-director. And he told us he had studied mathematics at Catholic University, all right? He told us the story about when he was studying mathematics at the university. Every time he asked a question in the first part of the course, the teacher always said, "We'll come to that." Right? And then after a certain point of the course, every time he asked a question, the teacher would say, "We already had that." So, well now, he said. So I encourage you to interrupt me anytime to ask questions, but don't be too surprised if the question you have responds with either one of those 2 answers. That we already saw that, or we'll come to it. Okay? All right, so that's the first thing. So that's the outline of your work. Okay, Frank, here comes Battersby at you with a few others. Well, let's hold up on those. Okay. Last year they had all of these handouts all bound together in one volume, but both Gus and I think, prefer to get them at you one at a time so we can comment on them. Is there any question about the outline of what we're going to try to do in the next 3 weeks here, or a little bit less than that actually? Really closer to 2. Okay, so the biographies of De La Salle, first of all, we always separate out the early biographers, that is, those who were contemporaries of the founder. One was a relatively young brother who was assigned by Brother Timothy, the second successor of De La Salle, to write the founder's life. And he was given all the notes that the brothers had sent in and all the memoirs and all of the documents in the founder's own hand and so on. And he wrote this biography of the founder. It was so terrible, the Superior decided that it wasn't worth publishing, and a good bit of it is lost. 80 pages have survived, and you have Bernard's biography among the souvenirs, the precious things that were handed out to you. One of the interesting things about this, in the original manuscript of this thing, he gave it to the founder's brother, Jean-Louis de La Salle. And Jean-Louis didn't like some of the stuff. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the Superior never published it. So he scratched a lot of it out and made comments in the margins. So sometimes that's a helpful clue. But there are clues in Bernard, and I think Brother Augustine will refer to them quite often, that give us a few little insights into him that we just don't get anyplace else. So it's interesting to have these three biographies written in a very, very different way. Now, then his nephew, Francois Maillefer, who became a Benedictine with the name Élie, which of course is French for Elias, and it's spelled differently in different things. He wrote a biography, and that was never published for the longest while. When I visited Reims with Lasallian Loes one time, he brought me into the library at Reims where the manuscript copy in Maillefer's own hand is still there. And so there's two manuscripts that have survived in Reims. Maillefer wrote this biography in 1723. The brothers weren't too happy with it, and there was a whole lot of problems connected with Jansenism and everything else, but somehow or other they gave it to Bland. Bland thought it was terrible when he wrote his biography, but then he stole a lot of the stuff. So Bland stole so much stuff from Maillefer. Maillefer, see the dates, Maillefer's first one is 1723, Bland comes out 10 years later. So then Maillefer sits down and revises his stuff and steals an awful lot of stuff from Blanc. Huh? So there's a lot of and that characteristic, this rivalry among Lasallian scholars, continues right down to this day. The little rivalry between Gus and myself is mild, for example, compared to what goes on between Léon Arose and Michel Sauvage. But anyway. So this was translated to English for the first time in 1962 or 3 by Brother Bill Quinn, and it has since been reprinted by St. Mary's Press. But Don Mouton has done a complete new translation of this, and it's in the works to be published out of Joe Schmidt's Lasallian Publications thing, and it will be a much better translation. There are quite a few inaccuracies in Bill Quinn's thing. Brother Maurice Auguste Hermans produced a French edition of this at the time of the Tercentenary in 1980 with some very extensive footnotes by way of commentary. And from time to time, as is appropriate, as we go through the material, I may be able to point some of that out to you. There are a lot of contradictions between the two. When you come to things like trying to date the sequence of events, for example, the very first years of the founder's life, it's almost impossible. When you read the material and you see dates there, or even sequence of events, you can't trust these people too much. They didn't have the type of approach to scholarship that we have today. Now, Bland's work came out in 1733. The superiors gave him everything they had. Most of it disappeared shortly thereafter. We haven't been able to, the founder's own memoir, for example, on the foundations of the Institute got lost in this process of tossing documents back and forth and so on. So, but anyway, Blanc had all of those things at his disposal, and it shows up quite often. You could almost reconstruct some of the founder's own writings simply by going through Maillefer, as you'll see. Richard Hernandez translated it for us. That has to be redone also before it's published in permanent form. We only had him do the 3 volumes of the biography because we never had those before in English. The fourth volume, of course, is the famous Spirit and Virtues. And when we were in the novitiate, this was thrown at you for spiritual reading, and you dragged that thing around along with Rodriguez, and you had all these stories, and that's one of the reasons why some of this, it took us a long time to begin to like the founder. But again, Brother Augustine has been involved in editing Bannon's translation of the Spirit and Virtues, and apparently there's a lot of material there that we don't find anyplace else either. And Gus will share a good bit of that with you when he talks about the founder's personality. So really we'll be dealing an awful lot with these early biographies. But the early biographers have to be filled out and criticized by some of the modern biographers. And these are some of the most important. Brother Lucard, he had an interesting life. He seemed to be a little better educated than most of the French brothers in the 19th century. He was born in 1821, died in 1895. He eventually became visitor up in Lille, I believe, and then he became a director again, and then he became visitor down in Bordeaux, the other end of France. He was born in Bayonne, so that was more or less his native time. But he was one of the ones who really tried to recover as much as possible. He was one of the first, I guess, to have a sense of the importance of the tradition in getting the documents together again. So in addition to A Life of the Founder, which was published in 1874, we'll see there's a copy of it over there in that collection. He also has 2 volumes of the history of the Institute called the Annales. So Rabelais is around in a lot of the communities. It was the founder was beatified in 1888, and so this thing came out at that time. It's a big, thick presentation volume with some marvelous cuts and lithographs, and it's around in a lot of the communities where they've been using it for a doorstop for years. But it's good for that purpose, among other things. But so Guibert, as you can see from the date 1900, that's the year the founder was canonized, and he put this history together, which is again a kind of a valuable one, and it draws heavily, I think, on Lucard. The first volume of Rigaud's 9-volume history of the Institute is in fact a biography of the founder from 1937. And of course, for years, the only English biography of the founder that we ever had was by Claire Battersby. And we had to go by that for the longest while. It's out of print now, and we used to, well, there'd be copies around, and you can read through it quickly if you want. At one time, we suggested people read it. But one of the reasons I was asked to produce a new English biography of the founder is that Battersby is both out of print and kind of out of date. Battersby tended to operate pretty much alone, and he didn't have, and he limited himself almost entirely to what he could find in the archives in the Mother House. And in writing this in 1957, that's the very moment when in the general chapter of 1956, when the Institute really became excited about doing serious scholarly work on the founder, to try to get critical editions of his writings, and to get critical editions of the early biographers, and to begin to find out what was the originality of his spirituality. And so there's a long story to that. But Battersby was already in print before all of that started. So he had, if you look down below at the Cahiers Lasallian, all of those, every single one of those 51 volumes have been produced since Battersby wrote his book. All right, so that's one problem with him. The other problem with Battersby, well, we have some brothers from Australia and some brothers from Ireland, so I guess I don't have to be too gentle when I speak about England. But there's a tendency in England all the time, and Battersby particularly, and a couple of those brothers from the London district, always to speak about the order. Oh, with the order this and the order that, and kind of in the monastic tradition of the Middle Ages. And Battersby thinks that way and writes that way. And of course, the other thing is, with all that sense of royalty and prestige and tying the founder into the major movements of the time, there's an awful lot of, Battersby is very, very interested in tying the founder into the major events that were happening in 17th century France, both the political events and all the great literary productions in the reign of the Sun King. But of course the problem is, when you get deep into the founder's biography, it's pretty evident that he had very little contact with any of that. He wasn't even interested in it. And as we'll see when we talk about his education, even his educational experience didn't put him into too much direct contact with that, at least not in his formal education. So that's a problem I always had with Battersby, that just to use a naughty word, and it's the first one that I'll use, but it will not be the last, he always strikes me as a little snooty. Of course, I should be careful here too, because one of the signs of oncoming senility is names escape me completely. But what's the name of the brother in the Toronto district who was, I think he studied under Battersby, didn't he?
Maybe Bonaventure.
Bonaventure Minor,
That's
just died a year or two ago. And he was very much influenced in his approach to the founder by Battersby, and certainly understandably, because he studied with him. And Bonaventure is a good historian, and he and I exchanged a few words from time to time. Always, of course, with fraternal respect for one another's scholarship. Had a big fight with him one time over the meaning of the word Christian in Christian schools, but maybe we'll talk about that tomorrow. So Yves Poutet's 2 volumes, the 17th century and the origins of the Lasallian movement, in 2 volumes, that's very, very thoroughly done from an historical point of view. You can find there almost everything about every one of the early foundations that took place in the founder's lifetime, plus a tremendous amount of background. And those 2 volumes are over there. And of course, the problem with all of this is you have to have some handle on French if you're going to use any of it. This Charles Lapierre's Marche en ma présence is a kind of a short biography, and one of the things that the French have kind of gotten onto, and that's why, in a way, when Gus said last night that I'm going to deal with the facts, well, yeah, I hope so, but one of the things that the French like to emphasize is this movement, that the founder's life is a kind of a journey. It's a cheminement. He's on the road. Or this quotation, I think it's a Pauline quotation, walk in my presence. And so he constructs the founder's life as a kind of a journey going and by roads and so on and so forth. We'll see. I'll share a little bit of his stuff with you when we start on the founder's life. He has a few prejudices of his own, too. Saturnino Gallego, and I've locked horns with him over 3 general chapters, produced a life which was passed around to all the delegates in the 1986 chapter. And the thing that I found most valuable for this is it's the only contemporary biography that has extensive footnotes. So in doing my own book, I stole most of his footnotes and incorporated them into my text without acknowledgement except for the introduction. Edward, oh, I'm a naughty boy. Edwin Bannon, this is a fantastic book. It really would fit, and probably do they use it in Buttimer 3? Yes. Yeah. You find it?
Very good.
Yeah.
After you've gone through
Yeah.
our transmission.
Yeah. So this is a kind of, Buttimer 1 softens you up for Bannon's book. Actually, what it really is, it's a translation or an interpretation or a commentary on Miguel Campos's thesis on those very important, he calls them parole force, these strong texts that come from the founder, the memoir on the habit and the vow formula and so on, and builds the spirituality around that. So that's a well worthwhile book, and if you persevere in this Buttimer thing, you'll come to that. It's dense and it's not an easy read, but it's worth all the effort you can put into it. And then, of course, this last obscure author down at the bottom here, as I said, I was asked to do this in a hurry because Joe Schmidt called me one day and he said, you know, we're getting an awful lot of requests for Lives of the Founder, and the only thing we have is the My Affair translation, and that's 17th century style, and Battersby is out of print, and so do you think you could throw something together in a hurry? So I said, well, all right. He said, well, could you do it in the next 2 years? I said, if I'm going to do it, it'd be done in the next 2 months. So I threw that together quickly, but it was easy to do because I'll tell you a secret, is that book was, all I did was take out my notes for the Buttimer 1 lectures and I put the book together. So that's one reason why we didn't give you a copy. Because if you read that, you could all go home. But I'm not. I don't want you to get away without going through Black, you know, because you don't really understand that book unless you go through Black. And when you go through Black, you'll understand the ambiguity in the title of it, that the work is yours, and unless you do the work, you're not going to be able to profit by this. So I think what Joe Josiak suggested was that maybe he'll give you order blanks so you can buy it at the end of this thing and use it as a review of the course if you haven't read it already. Now, in the 1956 general chapter, there was a Jesuit named Reyes who wrote an article in the French Dictionary of Spirituality on the spirituality of Jean-Baptiste Salm. And he's one of the first from outside the Institute to recognize that that the founder was perhaps the most neglected of all 17th century ecclesiastical figures, especially in the field of spirituality. And he said, you know, where has the Institute been doing something about getting some decent research, some real top-level scholarship going on the founder? So the general chapter of 1956, which deserves credit for an awful lot of things, read my next book, whole chapter on it, the general chapter decided to set up this, at the Mother House, this Center for Lasallian Studies, and to initiate this publication, this series of publications, which got to be called the Cahiers Lasallian. If your high school French translates cahier as notebooks, well, this is a little something different from the copybooks that people used in elementary classes. So since Michel Sauvage was already doing a doctoral dissertation and much interested in the founder's use of scripture, that turned out to be the first volume. So Michel Sauvage and Maurice Hermans were both studying theology at the time, and so they contributed their first 2 volumes to that thing. Then, in succession, they got the early biographers, the best the earliest printed editions they could, of Bernard, of Maillefer, and of Blanc. So that covers all those volumes from 4 to 9. Then there's an analytic index in 10. Then Maurice Hermans, by this time, had done his doctoral dissertation on the origins of the Bull of Approbation. And of course, we're having a lot of revisionary thinking about that Bull of Approbation, too. In a typical Roman fashion, the price we had to pay for the Bull of Approbation was to lose a tremendous amount of the originality of the founder's creation, which therefore means we lost an awful lot of our own identity that distinguishes the Institute of the Brothers from any other religious congregation. And of course, that process has been getting worse and worse and worse, and it still gets worse every day from the news we get from Rome on this, that, or the other. But, well, more of that later. I made a remark, something like that, over in Rome at the Ciel in November, and at that point, a Polish brother in the audience got up and walked out of the room. Said I was insulting the glory of Poland by making negative comments about His Holiness. Well, that won't be the last one either. But be patient. And just we'll have to take a look at that when we come to it. Anyway, that's number 11. Then, from 12 to 25, all of the first printed editions in lithograph form or duplicated form of the writings of John Baptist Loes. Now, 26 to 44, look at that tremendous number of volumes. The principal author of all of those is this Spanish brother, Leon Arroz, who made his novitiate and had all his formation in Lembeck. He's as much at home in French as he is in Spanish, and maybe even more so. And he's just one of these real ferret type of a scholar. So he's fascinated by the search for something new that nobody else had. So we'll spend hours and hours and hours in libraries, and he's one of the first who saw the need to break out of what the Institute itself had preserved, to begin to go into the archives in Reims, for example, or the National Library in Paris. And we knew enough from the early biographers that there must be some of these documents around. And he made some absolutely astounding discoveries. And all of these things were published very carefully and from a very scholarly point of view. He's one of the men for just the facts. This is part of the problem between himself and, let's say, Maurice Auguste and Michel Sauvage. They think that he's just, all those bare facts, they're standing there. What do they mean? And he's saying, well, they're making the facts mean whatever they want them to mean. So the facts are the facts. But he's that. So with that little bit of limitation, he has done absolutely fantastic work. And certainly, part of what you should do before you leave here, well, you'll see where the cahiers are over there a little later, is to thumb through some of them, because he became a very, very competent photographer in the process of doing this work. So he photographed all of these documents. So it's thanks to him that we have photographs of all the founders' own, everything that he was able to find in his own hand. We have a tremendous amount of background material that we would not otherwise have. He's digging it, and he's 72 or 73, and he's still very, very active pursuing this research. But he's a loner. He can only work alone. He's very difficult to get along with. But I must say he's a good personal friend. He and I got to know each other pretty well. I managed to get an honorary degree from Manhattan College with the occasion of the tercentenary, so that didn't do any harm. At one point, when he was mad at the people in Rome, he packed up and took all his stuff and left, and he was ready to burn it all. And then he wrote me a letter during the chapter of '86 that elected John Johnston, and he said, they told me, my advisors, which were not brothers, scholarly, oh, you can't destroy that. You have to give it to somebody. So he offered to give it to me. He said, if you'll stop here in Spain on your way back to New York, I'll give it to you. So I said, well, I can't possibly do that. So I sent him $50, and I said, pack it up and ship it. And so it never arrived, months after the chapter. And I often wondered what happened. All of a sudden, I get a letter from him, and he says, well, he said, the new superior, Brother John Johnston, asked me to resume my work on the founder. So he said, if anybody else asked me, je dis non. But if it's Brother John Johnston, je dis oui. So he says, you can't have the stuff. So he sent me back the $50. So since then, I visited him in Paris, and at that time he was just finishing what has now come out as down there as Cahiers 51. No, of course the CL is Cahiers Lasallian. On the founders, the founder was the executor of his father's will, huh? And according to the French law, what they had to do was take all of that stuff, all of the furnishings of the household, all the movable stuff had to be put up for auction. And then the proceeds divided among all the heirs. So De La Salle had to have a garage sale sort of thing. That's really what it was. But the bailiff came along and made an inventory of the whole thing. So we know practically every single dish that was in the father's house, down to the dishes, the drapes, the costumes, the musical instruments, everything. and all the property that they owned, and so on and so forth. And then who bought it back? The founder himself had to buy a lot of it back. And so the sisters got some of it, and so on and so forth. So it's fascinating, but it gives you a very, very real look into the way, the lifestyle that the founder had before he got involved with the brothers. So, and a description of the house and everything else. So that's, of course, he was only 20 years old when this was going on, 21, something like that. So, so that's a fascinating volume, and there are a couple of interesting correctives that provides for us, and we'll mention them as we go along. So Rose has started up again. He has a couple of more in the works. He has one on the Clément affair because he dug around into the archives of what survived from the Bastille, and he found out all of the. Of course, he swore me to secrecy not to tell anybody what he was doing, so I better not say any more. But anyway, he found a lot of the original documents referring to that. And he's doing another one on the clergy of Reims in the founder's lifetime, the things that they knew and so on. So he's got big dossiers in his room, you know, about 4 or 5 more cahiers. But he's publishing them now. He's doing his own editing because he had a big fight with them in Rome about the printer, who he said was guilty of all sorts of terrible typographical errors. So he's got his own printer, and he does these things more or less on his own. So it'll be interesting to see whether those volumes come out or not. I sometimes wish he'd get mad at them in Rome again and then send me all the stuff. But anyway, we'll see. 45 and 46, that's Miguel Campos' dissertation on the spiritual journey of John Baptist de La Salle. So that's more of that on-the-road type of a thing. And the first part of that is in Bannon's book. I think Brother Augustine's trying to persuade Ed Bannon, who's retiring now as the archivist in the Mother House. He's trying to persuade him to do the second one. For years and years and years, Yves Boutet was nowhere in this Lasallian collection. And if there's a rivalry between Arose and Michel Sauvage, it's practically downright disrespect and hatred, which is perhaps a little strong, between Boutet and Arose. At one point, Arose thought Boutet, when Boutet cites Arose, he never uses his name. He always just puts Ciel, Cahiers Lasallian. And Arose accused him of stealing some of his stuff and publishing it without his permission, and at one time threatened to sue him. So that's a very fine fraternal relationship going on there. Jean-Guy Roudet is a young, Rodrigue is a young Canadian. He's been in the Mother House now since he came there one year when I was, just before that chapter, in 1984, and he's more or less taking over a good bit of the direction of these Lasallian studies. And so he's got a good sense of source material. That's his particular contribution. Where did the founder get all these ideas from? And so he's done an awful lot of research on that, and the first fruits of his research have been published in this collection of the founder's meditations for Sundays and feasts, yes? Just for the feast. And Brother Augustine has been working on the English translation of that. And are we ever going to see it?
Well, what he did, what I asked him to do was to write the introduction to Richard Arnande's translation of the meditation.
Okay.
So that is to translate his introduction.
Yes, oh, okay. I'm sure Brother Augustine will have something more to say. And Brother Augustine, I'm sure, will refer to Cahiers 49 as a coffee table size book with every known portrait of the founder and a commentary on how authentic it is. And I presume that it's over there in that. Very, very interesting to go through. Sauvage and Campos, in the very first session of Ciel, S-I-E-L, not C-I-E-L, which stands for Sessions Internationales des Études Lasalliennes, that the General Chapter of 86 decided that they should bring brothers from all around the world to Rome to spend a whole year getting soaked in Lasallian background and scholarship. And so the first one, which was went on from 88 to 89, Campos and Sauvage ran it, and at the time they were working out this very fine presentation of the founders' work on mental prayer, on the method of mental prayer, and the commentary is twice as long as the text goes. And you might be interested in taking a look at that. And we're trying to that's in the works too, to be published in English, and they're just trying to decide how much of the commentary to take, but it's a whole history of spirituality associated with it and everything else. And I've already spoken about 51. Now, in addition, if you're interested in doing Lasallian studies, there are 6 volumes. Have any of you ever seen them at all? Called the Vocabulaire Lasallian, where they simply have every single important word in the founders. It's a concordance of the founders' work. So if you want to know what the founder said, for example, about any topic, you can go to this thing. You don't have to be an expert in French, and find out all the uses of that word. So, so if you ever have occasion, give a talk on the founder, for example, on consecration, or the Holy Spirit, or community, which is interesting, because by that he means the institute most of the time, or any other word. And then what they're doing now, there's a project over in Rome where they're asking some brothers around the world to write essays, to take some of the keywords. How many, Gus, altogether? About 230 of the most important words, and to write up a summary of the way the founder uses those against the background of the French literature at the time. So the deadline for that stuff is in December, and Gus is working on a couple of the articles and so on. What are you doing, Gus? Modesty?
Modesty, piety, and suffering.
Yes. He's been through Buttimer 5 times, so you can see.
What are your words?
I forget, but I got consecration and apostles, and I think I have ministry. Or I think I have mystery. I get all those theological things. Well, anyway. But that'll be interesting, and I think they intend to produce this in 3 languages. Is it not so? So that some of us who are involved in Lasallian research will cull that vocabulary Lasallian to make it even more meaningful. But it's worth taking a look at over there. Now, the final thing here on the list are the issues of Lasalliana that they started a few years ago. At one time they abandoned the project, but then they decided to go at it again. And so it's back in business. And how many have seen Lasallian? How many have not? All right, we can take a look at it over there. And every issue, the first part of it, there's all sorts of stuff in it, some of it of different value and all that. But it's very, very helpful for Lasallian studies, and it's easy, and they issue it in 3 languages. And so if your community doesn't get it, it's certainly worth subscribing to. And you'll get some samples of it here, which you'll be reading before the day is over, I'm sure, won't you? We'll pass them out after the break. Okay, any question about any of that? Yes?
From the giants to the dwarfs, when I was in the Scholastica, I remember reading a book by a man from this campus. His name was Brother Leo, and he wrote a book on the founder. And since I was young and inexperienced, I had no way of evaluating. What's your main comment on that effort?
Well, I have to be honest with you and say I haven't read it since I was in the Scholastica. No, well, that was the famous Brother Leo from California, who was a great literary man and all that. And it's my memory of it is that it's just an easy read, and it's a quick glance. But again, he wrote that thing without any effort at criticism or scholarship, and so I really don't have any comment on it, except for the fact that he does, towards the end, in his dramatic way of writing, he does have a rather condensed and graphic description of the founder's death, his last illness and death. And I've pulled that out and used it in the community when we come to, if Good Friday coincides again with the founder's death or something like that, it makes a good meditation for a community prayer service. So it could be useful for that. Does anybody else want to say anything about Brother Leo's thing? Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Another question.
Gus, do you want to say anything about Leo's?
No.
Okay.
Could you comment on the title of the most recent biography in English on the founder, 1989? Title of that biography.
Yes.
The meaning, or what's the significance of that
Yes.
title?
Well, we'll see that as we go along a little bit, and we finally hit on that title. At one point, the founder made a retreat, and he had, I think that's where it's from, isn't it, that quotation? And he made a retreat, and he had a whole series of certain resolutions and things. And among one of them, he's addressing the Lord, and he says, I don't know whether the schools will succeed or whether they won't succeed. But he said, the whole thing, Lord, is in your hands. And then as he said to Habakkuk, Domine opus tuum, Lord, the work is yours. Right? So that's a very, very important, it reflects the founder's attitude towards the whole, towards the Institute, and part of his relationship to God, too. About from his point of view, it was the present, to my mind, his spirituality centers around the concept of the presence of God, and that's why we'd like to bring that alive at the beginning of every one of our sessions, and the providence of God. And so that this whole thing was in God's hands. And so we'll see that in context when we come to it. But using it as a title for the book, addressing this to the brothers, with all this question of uncertainty of the future and so on and so forth. So you can read that title 3 or 4 different ways, and it's deliberately put there with that ambiguity. Yes?
That comes from the Canticle of Habakkuk, and it's part of the Christian prayer. It comes in as one of the Psalms that we say as part of the 4-week cycle. And the relevance to our times is very clear. If you take the whole Canticle, you remember these words, that there are no herds in the stalls, and the vineyards are not producing any fruit. Habakkuk is describing a time of poverty, and the appeal is, we trust you, Lord, to take care of us in spite of the fact that we're being wiped out. And so it's very apropos of present circumstance. You'll check it when you come, next time you read that in the morning prayer. You'll see how relevant it was to Lasallian's mindset through all the difficulties that he went through.
Okay. Yeah.
Number 5 and
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Number 5, Brother Maurice Hermans was going to put together the text of the Memoir on the Habit with a commentary. But Arose was in the process of doing something with it at the same time. So that's one reason it was skipped. And Maurice was waiting for Arose's stuff to come in before. And then when it was clear that maybe that wasn't going to work that way, Maurice addressed himself to that question and decided that he would do it himself. The very last time I ever saw Morris in Rome, I was leaving at the, I guess it was the end of the chapter, or maybe the end of one of those CL things, 1989 it was. And he said, oh, Luke, goodbye. He said, what can we do for you here? I said, where is Kaye number 5? Numero 5. And he laughed. He said, well, we'll get around to it. Well, he has died since. So I think Michel Sauvage has now promised, it's in the works, it'll be coming out of Rome, and he's going to combine it with a tribute to Maurice. And so that will be coming through one of these days. It's time, everybody's telling me. Well, that's good, you ask a lot of questions. The signer wrote. We go to Dryden, do we?
Right, we have a half-hour break now.
This morning, we've already seen people writing about De La Salle. Now we ought to have some idea of what De La Salle himself wrote. And so this white sheet that's being passed around actually lazy person that I am, this sheet was prepared in 1984 by one of the Buttimer 2 people was in here just asking for my notes to the yellow. But this was prepared in 1984 by Joe Schmidt when he was proposing to us this plan to, over a 10-year period, to produce in English, in New English translations, all the writings of the founder. So for the discussion, that's what this was prepared for. And there are the references to the appropriate issue of the Lasallian where these things could be found. So this is a simple way of seeing the principal writings of the founder that have been published. And the project of producing them all in English is moving along. So the first one, which dates from, one of the oldest, dates from 1695. The founder wrote this thing, The Rules of Politeness, or whatever you want to call them. This was, he used it in the schools as a reader. And it's just, has anybody read it? Anybody read any of it? So it's quite fascinating, isn't it, to read some of that stuff. How to go to sleep at night, and what position to take in bed, and how to clean your ears, and how to eat at the table, and all those things. It's a very good introduction by Greg Wright to the thing to explain what it's all about. And what it means historically, but it gives you some kind of an insight again into the background of the founder. Now, number 2, which was produced in Paris in 1793 for the first time, The Duties of a Christian. This is this you can see from it 2 and 3. There's 3 parts to it, and this is the longest of the founder's works. And effectively, part 2 is the founder's catechism. And Jean Pongier over in, who's another one who's done an awful lot on the founder's educational writings, has produced a very good commentary in French on that, but it hasn't been put into English yet, so far as I know. At least not published in English. Maybe Oswald. Now you have a separate sheet talking about that one, and so if you have any interest at all, and this is the gray sheet, this is by a Spanish brother whom I do not know, gives you a little bit of an idea of the founder as a producer of catechisms. Of course, catechisms were the principal instrument for religious instruction in the schools at that time. And I guess this might be the time to point out the reasons why the founder talks so much about references to the principal mysteries and all of that. And this was one of the major dynamisms behind him in conducting the schools, because according to the theology at that time, you could not attain salvation if you had reached the use of reason unless you were able to make an explicit act of faith in the principal mysteries of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Redemption. So this was an essential ingredient in a person's salvation. And so a terrific motivating force behind the founder in getting these kids to be able to enunciate and to have some, at least to be able to make an act of faith in those specific mysteries. And all of the theology at the time said that for any adult, this was a necessary condition for salvation. For example, the Jesuits, when they went to Paraguay, wrote back to Rome saying, well, we have these Indians and they're leading pretty good lives and all that sort of stuff, but their linguistic skills are minimal and so on and so forth, and could we baptize them? So the answer came back from Rome saying, if they have reached the use of reason, no, unless they're unconscious. If they go into a coma and they're terminal, then you can baptize them conditionally. But the Jesuits were forbidden to baptize the Indians until they could make an explicit act of faith in the Christian mystery. So that ability to be able to enunciate and make an explicit act of faith in these things was a very important part. So this is one of the reasons why this is such a developed work on the part of the founder. The catechism for use as an educational tool, and the rest of it for developing the doctrinal background for the brothers, to give them a theological education. So it's an interesting work, and it isn't even on the horizon yet as far as I know. Do you know if anybody's working on it? I think Hernandez is going to translate everything, but I don't think an editorial team has yet been. So that's 2 and 3. The management of the Christian schools, you will know, you're familiar with that in a way. That has come down to us. We have a manuscript version of that from 1706, not in the founder's hand. Probably when you read that stuff in the old rule about the copying letters by hand, this is one of the things the brothers did. They made their own copies. They wrote them out. So that's very close to publication. Then number 5 is an abbreviation of 2 and 3, because it's such a long work for people who were not speed readers. Number 6 is clear. That's the prayers for Mass, Confession, Communion. And number 7 are the exercises of piety during the day, which some of us used way back in grammar school days. The parenthesis about omitting the songs in these was directives for the translation project, that they decided to omit the songs. Then I think they may have rethought that. There's some reason for putting them back in. They did the same thing we did. They wrote pious words to well-known popular tunes with part of the time. Then the letters, of course, have since been published in English. Brother Augustine edited that in its final phase, and it's marvelous work, and he'll be referring to it continually, and you have a copy of it. The rule, we'll get into the rule a little bit later. The earliest version is a kind of a daily coutumier, and then the 1705 edition of the Common Rules with the 1718 additions, which are very significant. We'll talk about that. Then the 3 sets of meditations. Brother Augustine pioneered in the very fine translation of meditations for the time of retreat, which I guess may be revised a little bit. Then the method of mental prayer. The first printed edition of that is 1739, according to what I have here. Then the collection, and then finally this memoir on the habit, which is very important, and we'll see a little bit about that when we do the biography. So those are the works of the founder. All right? Now, if you'll go to the pink sheet, the known manuscripts of John Baptist de La Salle, you ought to have some idea of this. If you ever get to the Mother House, one of the very fine experiences you can have is to see some of these things actually physically and handle them in the founder's own hand. And the most precious ones, as it describes here, are put together, are kept in glass containers, protected from even being handled. Now the pink sheet deals almost completely with the version I have is not pink and it's both sides. But the pink one is all about the letters, and I'll leave it up to Brother Augustine he'll talk to you about that. So we can skip the pink sheet and go, what's the next one? Number 2 is that green? Yeah. The green one. So what have we got? What else was written? And the whole thing was written and signed by De La Salle. First of all, that formula of perpetual vows, which he wrote himself and then had copied so the others could fill in their name. Now that's one of the most precious documents that we have. The founder making the vow with the brothers for the perpetual vows for the first time, 1684. We'll see that in context. And it's signed by himself, of course. Then he wrote 3 obediences to this brother Joseph, commissioning him to visit the various communities. Then some of these other documents were things that he made at the end of his life to transfer things that were in his own name, since the Institute had no corporate status, to Brother Bartholomew so that it could be handed down. And then, as you will find out if you don't know already, he was the executive for Nicholas Roland's will. So all of those things are there. This all was written, obviously, by Brother Edwin Bannon, the archivist of Mother House. Marvelous gentleman, by the way. The model of an archivist, the model of a Christian gentleman, and he was director of novices in London at one point. Some of those who had him as a director said he wasn't always so marvelous in those days, but, well, a lot of directors of novices were not at that time either. But he's just marvelous to work with, and he's very generous about almost careless, and if you go there to do research, of letting you take stuff to your room and things like that, which an archivist is never supposed to allow you to do. But he's been extremely helpful to me, and very supportive and enthusiastic, and been very helpful in this whole project of getting the founder's stuff into English that Joe Schmidt did. All right, so now if we go to the third, the blue sheet, Now, these are documents written by De La Salle, but he didn't sign them. And Gus will do a good bit of this with you, but you ought at least to know what we had. So the memoir on the habit, we do not have his memoir on the origins of the Institute, but we do have his writing on the habit. One of the stories about that is that we had, of course, there was a violent discussion on the habit in the 1966 chapter. And so in the 1966 chapter, of course, it was decided that, well, the habit would be the official habit, but that it was possible to make adaptations or to wear something else. And in that discussion, there was a lot of back and forth on the thing. And those who maintained that, no, everybody should have the same habit, should wear it all the time, and so on and so forth. So after the chapter made a decision in another direction, somebody got into the archives and started underlining passages and found it really a terrible, terrible thing to do with this document. And it would have to be somebody in very, very high place. We think we know who it is. So anyway, that will be Kaye number 5 when it comes out, and it describes a little bit about everything. Down in the 1, 2, 3, the 4th paragraph, one of the interesting things we have are these certificates of assiduity. The way they didn't keep records in registrar's offices in the universities in those days, so when a student finished a course, he wrote out in his own hand, this is to certify that John Baptiste de La Salle, a student of so-and-so, in this particular course, has successfully passed all the requirements of the course, and so on and so forth, and summa cum laude, or whatever it might be. And then the professor signed it, and then 3 or 4 other students signed it. So we have 4 of those from De La Salle. 2 of them in his own hand, and 2 written afterwards by fellow students of it. So they're in the Mother House too, and they're quite interesting. They indicate how, that's one of the famous words we'll see a lot about, is the assiduity of De La Salle as a student. And of course that's open to some terrible puns. And so we hope that you will all be characterized by assiduity during the course of the next 3 weeks. And then on the next page, there's a couple of things about some little additions he put onto certain documents, some of which, of course, are very, very important. And one of the most important of all would be the document that he drew up, the account of his guardianship. And Brother Augustine will have a lot to say about that. Then we have his signatures. There are other documents that he simply had to sign for one reason or another, beginning with one when he was 15 or 16 years old. And we'll see a little bit of that perhaps tomorrow or the next day. And so that's, so we have very ample samples of his handwriting, and these 99 signatures that still exist go all the way from the time he was 15 years old until just before his death. Right. So that's what we have from the founder himself. We have all of these writings, and they're all in the Cahiers, and we have all of these documents, and Loes has photographed every single one of these things. So in various issues of the Cahiers Lasallian, which are referred to here, you can find samples of the founder's own handwriting if you're interested. That's it. Anybody here involved in handwriting analysis? Well, it might be interesting to get the founder stuff. It has been done, and we'll make a comment about that. Maybe either I will or Brother Augustine will, or maybe we both will, about what that revealed about it. Okay? All right, now you ready to take a little walk? Let's go over and meet Mr. Andre Simon, and he really calls himself Andrew Simon, in spite of the reference in the book that you have there. And
last week, one brother introduced the meeting with a slight variation on our usual call to recollection. I'm going to use it now, and please don't feel that it's inappropriate. But let it be a call to recollection. Let us remember that God is in our holy presence to one another. St. John Baptist de La Salle.
Praise God.
Live Jesus in our hearts.
Forever.
Somebody asked if Luke comes to every one of my presentations. And I said, so far he has, but I've given him carte blanche to leave and not be present for any of them. We have pages 1, 2, and 3 of that beautiful morning prayer here, and Chris is going to make copies of page 4 in case brothers would like to have a copy or several copies. How many would like to have? Okay, I think you've made about 20 copies. That should be enough. And we'll just leave these here. I'm honored to talk at the Buttimer Institute because Brother Charles Henry was a very close friend of mine. Perhaps not as close as he was in friendship to Luke, who spent many more years living with him. But in 1946, he was the director of the Scholasticate in Washington, and I was the director of the junior aid at Barrytown. And we were selected to go to the second novitiate together. And in that process, I got to know him quite well, and especially admire him. I've commented that in 1946, 2 of us from the New York district were sent to the second novitiate, and one of us was destined 20 years later to be the superior general. How close can you get? 20 years later, Charlie appointed me visitor of New York on strong advice from my best friend Leo Kirby, and after an election which was subsequently contended by people whose motives are suspect. I'm honored also to be associated with Luke. Luke and I began teaching each other in 1934. I was his biology teacher at Christian Brothers Academy in Albany, my first year teaching. During the last 10 years, the mutual teaching has been intensified. At one time, however, I sat at his knee in the opening of the Graduate Religious Studies program at Manhattan College. I usually say that in biology, I taught him everything he knows about sex. You'll have a very interesting repartee tomorrow. He taught me everything I knew up till recently about ecclesiology, but since the early 60s, there's been a lot of change in ecclesiology, I believe. I also studied with Luke at Louvain, which very few people know, and I taught at Tübingen, so I have good theological credentials. I was visiting Luke at Louvain when he had his sabbatical, and I went to school with him one day. And there was another brother who was studying theology at Tübingen, but also teaching in the local elementary school, and I taught one of his classes in Tübingen that morning. To familiarize yourself with some of the secrets about Luke's life, I've taken the liberty, and I forced permission from him this morning, to bring his Golden Jubilee programs, in which there is, I think, an autobiography of him and some very fine pictures. Also a congratulatory letter from the Superior General and a very fine mass program. Don't miss the beautiful picture on the back of de La Salle and himself.
Are we each getting one of those?
I'll leave you that there, and I want it to be there tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Give you a chance to browse in it, but leave it there. I was working on the editing of the letters when this Buttimer Institute was organized, And it was on that basis, I think, more than anything else, that Luke suggested to me that I be part of this Buttimer Institute and focus on the personality of De La Salle. He also mentioned that as I've mentioned to you the other evening, my interest in the portraits of De La Salle, and said that that would be something that I could get involved with. What I've given you is the slightly altered objective that we were asked to draw up for our presentation in 1986 when we began. And it's a typical classroom objective. At the end of the course, participants will be able to describe facets of De La Salle's natural personality as distinct from his acquired virtues as portrayed in the early biographies, and give specific examples from his letters as well as from the biographies. Describe De La Salle's spiritual direction of the brothers as revealed in the letters and in relation to the directory in the original collection, and describe insights into their own spiritual life that have been enhanced from the study of De La Salle's relationship with his brothers in the letters. There's no intention here to minimize the supernatural virtues of De La Salle. I think as we go along, it might be observed that the supernatural was built on something that was there earlier, originally, that he was endowed with by nature. Pertinent to the value of reading the letters are some remarks by Athanase Emile in the introduction to the first publication of the letters in French in 1953, I think, as a circular. This was the original publication of the letters, Circular 335, and it was published in 1952. And in the introduction, Athanase says, "In the letters of our founder, you will read a phrase that by God's grace will give you a feeling of personal relevance. You will read an encouragement that meets the present moment's need of your own soul." And this is typical of Athanase Emile. "You will read a holy reproof that will sound in your heart as if it had crossed through space and time to capture your attention here and now." And in the introduction to Battersby's publication of the letters, he says, "A simple sentence from the saint's pen occasionally reveals a charming trait hitherto unsuspected. No one can read through his letters without admiring his spirit of understanding, his fatherly interest in each individual brother, his unfailing patience with the weaker members of his society, his knowledge of the minute details of community life, and his devoted care to supply each of his disciples with what he needed. No one can claim to know the saint until he has felt his heart pulsating beneath his correspondence, and until he has detected that warm touch of human nature which makes all the world kin." There's a problem in researching De La Salle's personality. He is presented in the early biographers as a saint, full of all the supernatural virtues. His principal biographer has this aim: to present a candidate for canonization, to be able to qualify as venerable for the practice of heroic virtues. The spirit of the age regarding holiness was rigorous. Grace must replace nature. Blaine says he had taken for his motto that there is more grace when there is less nature. And again, later on, "Nothing is truer than what the incomparable St. Teresa says, where there is less nature, there is more grace." This is the spirit regarding holiness at the time. I think that our emotions are one of the best ways to come to an understanding of at least a large aspect of our personality. In De La Salle's time, the spirit was to suppress emotions. A brother Alphonse wrote a French study of De La Salle's spirituality, à l'école de Saint Jean-Baptiste de La Salle, and he makes this comment: an edifying biography of the 17th century in the spirit of Cartesian thought would avoid mentioning the emotions, movements of the animal soul, considered as weaknesses. Spiritually, the morale of Port Royal prescribed the mastery of one's sensibility. Tronson, one of De La Salle's spiritual formateurs, would guide a person to continually watch over oneself so as not to be guided by any instinctive movement of feeling. In one meditation, De La Salle speaks of impassibility, total suppression of feeling, as the summit of perfection. Blaine likes to describe De La Salle as a man unmoved by suffering or other feeling. There's also a third reason why the spirit of the age was one of rigor. It comes through to us that way. Emphasis on the so-called negative virtues, mortification of the body and the mind, humility, obedience, all aimed at, and this is a technical 17th century spiritual term which Luke will explain, annihilation of corrupt nature. No one has really done a project on the personality of De La Salle. The focus of the projects, as Chris will explain probably during the course of the week at one of the 4 o'clock meetings, is more orientated to community and school practices. One man did do a study of the personality of De La Salle, making use of the Myers-Briggs typography as a methodology. And that was Norman Cook, the brother who played golf, a former visitor of California. He did an excellent job, and at the end I'm going to give you a summary of what he produced. But if any of you is interested, as I have been, in trying to come to an understanding of what kind of a human, natural person De La Salle was, before he went through all the discipline of the age in which he lived to be the saint that he is, here are some suggestions. As you read Blaine, look for facts. Look for incidents that reveal something. For example, there's a beautiful little story about the time after he had moved into the Rue Neuve, the cradle of the Institute, in 1682, and he had adopted some of the great simplicity and poverty of the brothers and the teachers, in fact, the teachers at that time. One of his old friends, who was an abbot, maybe wrong on calling him an abbot, an abbé anyway, came up with his horse and carriage to visit De La Salle. And when De La Salle came out to meet him, his friend said, "Is this the way a man of your status is living?" And De La Salle shrugged his shoulders and smiled. But that interchange, it's a fact, and I don't think it's unhistorical in Blaine. But I think that you study that interplay, and you get some idea of what kind of a person, a human person, we're dealing with. There was an instinct, that, as I will tell you later, is a kind of an instinctive reaction that De La Salle gives in similar situations. Also, as you read the letters, and a little bit in Blaine even also, look for the expression of emotion. Be surprised how much emotion De La Salle expresses in his letter and his relationship with the brothers. And then as you go through, begin clustering salient traits. One of the studies that has not been done, I've made a very superficial attempt at it, but I recommend it to somebody as a project. Analyze the rules which I have imposed upon myself. What kind of a personality would write those rules? What are the common factors running through the writing of those rules? The topics, of course, will be the letters. And while I'm going to give you a schedule, which if you follow, you will have read all the letters, I presume that a good number of you have read the letters already. They were published in '88. But I'd like to focus particularly on the letters to Matthias, Hubert, and Roland. And I would especially ask you to read as many letters as you can. Read them all if possible, but you have a much heavier reading schedule in Blaine. But if you don't read any of the letters at all, make sure you read the 20 letters that were saved by Gabriel Roland. They are the most significant of all. And if you have a chance to read any of the others, read the 10 letters to Matthias. In my presentation over the past 5 years, I've learned tremendous myself from the questions of the Buttimer Institute and from my own effort to improve. The first time I gave it, somebody put in the critique, where was the meat? Where was the beef? And I tried to add more beef as the years go on. So I've incorporated more biographical material independent of the letters. And I've rearranged some of the approach this year for the first time in response to a brother's remark that it would be great if you could somehow coincide the letters with the life as Luke develops it. And that's impossible, but I've made some attempts this year, and I'll refer to it shortly. I would like at the end that as many of you who have some familiarity with the Myers-Briggs, which is the most common non-psychiatric personality typography, if you would tell me, maybe I'll pass out a piece of paper, and you write down what you think is the Myers-Briggs for John Baptist De La Salle. First year I did this, I wrote to Miguel Campos and asked him, as one I thought most familiar with John Baptist De La Salle, to please study the Myers-Briggs material in case he didn't know about it, and to put down what he considered to be De La Salle's Myers-Briggs. And after several weeks he wrote back, I've tried, Gus, I'm sorry, but I just can't do it. Big help, Miguel, big help. Every year, a good number of the brothers have felt enough familiarity with De La Salle and with the Myers-Briggs to make an attempt. And I'll give you the results of your own observations and of past observations. And they're rather consistent. And that's why I have attached the last 2 pages. I'm not going to go over those last 2 pages now. I just want you to have them in case you want to brush up on what the Myers-Briggs is. It could even be possible that you don't know anything about it now, but by reading that material, it's not that complicated or difficult. You could still probably make an effort to diagnose the founder. On the second sheet that you have there, I've given you my effort to predict how the week is going to go. And the readings in the beginning, I'm giving you very little readings. It's my effort to cooperate with Luke. Most of you are familiar with what the Coleman Loes says in the introduction. I picked out a few pages there that I thought would be, and also in the appendix. Glance over those things anyway. Skim through, and if you do any focusing, I'm suggesting a few pages you focus on. Will help you as we go through the next couple of days, particularly the fourth presentation. Now, in the second and third presentation, presumably tomorrow and the next day, I'm anticipating, and I'm trying to give you a summarization of what has come through to me. This is what I call last night, I call fanciful. I'm being, excuse the expression, creative in my effort to put together everything that I've picked up in the course of the last 5 years and more. In editing the meditations of the founder, I've come to feel that I have a real understanding of his mind, and then when I come to the portraits, I see in his portraits, I can see relationship to the things that he's written, and the letters included. So I'm going to give you brash hypotheses on family influence. One, his relationship to people, and we're going to give a row of biographical incidents to kind of bolster my theory. And then family influence two, his relation to work. Freud, I think, someplace says that there are only two things that involve a person's life and character: loving and working. And so I don't feel like I'm being entirely fanciful, although I'm prepared to accept Luke's ultimate critique. But it'll be stimulating to you. You can enjoy disagreeing with me. And then the rest is rather clear. I spend the whole period on spiritual direction. I may have to add a few things that I won't be able to get over tonight. But the letters of De La Salle are really all that we have left of any kind of individual spiritual direction given by De La Salle. To understand the letters, you have to have an understanding of De La Salle's idea of spiritual direction. And in going over his life, Luke will develop, I think, from time to time, how De La Salle used spiritual direction. We don't agree entirely on how he used the spiritual direction, but there's no question that De La Salle himself, in the course of his life, had 7 or 8 different spiritual directors at moments of great decision making. And as far as the brothers are concerned, I want you to understand how much this meant to him in relation to the brothers and what the letters represent in regard to that. The rest is pretty clear. Are there any questions? Yes, Frank.
Perhaps the greatest strength of De La Salle was the fact that he was always under spiritual direction.
I don't think he was always under spiritual direction.
And is it one of our problems that because we're not under spiritual direction, we're not able, like he was, to help others so much? Is there a clear relationship in that between receiving direction and giving direction?
I may get into that tomorrow, Frank. We may come to that, as Luke says. It touches on that last end of the course. Describe insights into their own spiritual life that have been enhanced, etc.
Okay. Do you know if anybody has taken as a project the astrological chart of De La Salle?
The
Astrological chart.
Oh, no. Great idea, Phil. I've added the Enneagram this year because Leo Kremer, I pronounced his name right? Kremer. Brought up the Enneagram 3 years ago, and he was going to do a project on that, but he never got through to it. But I took a workshop on the Enneagram myself last fall, and one of the brothers here taking the course is going to focus on the Enneagram during the course, and at the end we'll give some report. And I've asked Joe Schmidt, and I've asked Charles Ruderman to tell me what they feel. They're both up on Enneagram, and I've asked them to tell me how they consider De La Salle on the Enneagram. Now, astrology, fine. If you want to work on that still, it'd be a good project. You could write to Nancy and have her, give her This page, entitled The Letters of De La Salle, is a summary I made several years ago. It runs parallel to that page which Luke gave you that Edwin Bannon drew up, but it approaches it a little differently, so that if you read both of them, they'll kind of cross-check one another. This is an effort to summarize pretty much what we know about the letters of De La Salle. Incidentally, it's the most interesting item to consider the letters of the saints. St. Catherine of Siena, for example, wrote over 400 letters. I haven't had a chance to get them, but it's interesting how many saints' letters have been preserved. St. Teresa of Avila, I read in the U.S. Catholic in '89, estimated about 15,000 letters. She was some reformer. They have only 250 autographed, but there are 470 extant copies, etc. Ignatius Loyola, I think they have a collection of over 4,000 of his, and they published a book which they just selected 250. In Cardinal Newman's process, they are going over something between 50 and 70,000 letters, both to and from Cardinal Newman. Francis de Sales also has it. I haven't got the numbers on him. But this, if you stop and think, it goes back to Ignatius of Antioch and Clement and Paulinus. We've been collecting the letters of saints, for a long time. And they're very valuable because they're so personal. Great insights into the thinking and the feeling. We have 53 originals, which are called autographs, because we have the original piece of paper and the writing of De La Salle. And I'm going to leave this on the table up here, which I'd like you to study and just glance and look at. There are two photographs. This is What the Brothers of the Generalate Do. Came out in '84.
Are they blank pages?
Among other things, there's an article on the archives. And I've taken the liberty to insert a picture of myself in the archive taken in October 1986 by the archivist, in which I'm standing in front of the safe where the letters are kept and holding one of the letters in my hand. The picture was taken by the great man Edwin Bannon, the archivist. And I've also inserted a picture I took of him on that occasion, and I've taped it into the book. I'd like you to see, he just, as Luke said, a wonderful gentleman. And he is a scholar of the first class, just a magnificent scholar. He's written an introduction to the fourth book of Blaine, which he translated, which I had the privilege of editing. When you edit his work, there's nothing you can do but just admire the way the guy writes, and perfect typing, everything is just amazing what work he does. In the introduction to the fourth book of Blaine, on the spirit and virtue. Like 170 pages, introduction. And then he has footnotes, which cover another like 115 pages, in which he quotes, refers to the references of Blaine. Blaine makes many references, like to the early church fathers. Edwin has traced them back to mean and has put the Latin down there. He's just an extraordinary scholar, and unassuming, and obliging, and he looks at generous and trusting. Unbelievable. When I was in Rome last January, February, at the gerontology meeting, he gave me carte blanche in the archive, and in the course of my visit, I made photocopies of over 200 pages of material. I've been asked to write a book by the Lasallian publication on the early brothers who lived with De La Salle, and I took advantage of being there to gather some material, but I photocopy it and could take things out of the material. Unbelievable. 51 originals are in the archive. One is in England, one is in Reims, in the provincialates, and each one of those two is a wonderful story in itself. I'll come back to that. 7 copies are considered complete and authentic. 4 made during the general aid of Brother Agathon, 2 made during the beatification process, and 1 found in the collection of early documents of the Dijon school. 36 letters, in addition to 53 and 7, are in what's called Manuscript 22 in the Rome archives, which is a pre-Revolution, French Revolution copy of a collection composed to illustrate various virtues. 17 are found only in this Manuscript 22. 37 other letters in Blaine's life, largely excerpts to show various virtues, but some complete, especially to other religions. Altogether, Blaine has 61 citations, 24 found elsewhere, and 37 found only in Blaine. And it's an interesting fact that Edwin brings out in that paper that Luke gave you, that all the letters that Blaine is found only in Blaine are lost. And Blaine has used none of the letters that we have extant today. A strange dichotomy there. There's a corpus of letters that Blaine used that has been lost. And some people think we can still find them. Then there's one of these 134, which is in the biography of Brother Irénée, written in 1774 by Bertrand de la Tour. The letters that are in Blaine are not in the Battersby edition. That's one of the advantages of the critical edition. I'll come back to this. One of the new edition of the letters. 34 autographs were used in the process of beatification. 19 other letters have been found since then. 2 of them are number 2, which is the earliest letter we have, except the one in 1682, which is way out of whack. From 1682 to 1701 we have the letters, but the letter number 2 in 1701 was discovered in England in 1955 by a librarian at the Upshaw College. And it was in a bundle of other personal documents, an amazing thing. And he recognized it as possibly a letter of De La Salle, brought it to the brothers. The bishop gave the brothers permission to keep it as long as it would not leave England. And it's kept at the provincialate in England. And the number 133, which is to his brother about his last will and testament, was discovered in 1969 in a lawyer's office. And the lawyer has given permission for it to be kept at the the provincialated reams. If you read the page that Luke gave you about the letters, Edwin Bannon does a little play with the different time periods between the discovery of letters and is projecting when the next letter should be discovered according to the pattern of discovery. Of those 34 autographs used in the process of beatification, 20 of them are Drolan letters. Gabriel Drolan, what a marvelous character. And we'll come to that in reading of his letters. But he kept 20 letters written to him by De La Salle. And those autographed letters make up the large portion of what were used in the beatification. Regarding that, in the decree on the writings attributed to the Venerable De La Salle, there were 17 publications that were presented and then withdrawn because there was no proof of the authenticity of those works, in the strict sense of the term, by De La Salle. They were not in his handwriting, he had not signed it, there was no attribution, even in the publication, I think, that he had written them. Since the works are not signed by De La Salle, none of the problems raised in them can be attributed to him. And these writings are to be considered apocryphal. Only the 34 letters will be examined. This was a decree on January 10th, 1852. And, quote, in them, 34 letters, nothing contrary to the orthodox faith and the good morals has been found, or anything indicative of a new doctrine that is suspect and contrary to the common faith of the Holy Roman Church. It probably was a strategy in the process to withdraw all those 17 writings of De La Salle in order to hasten the process and also to prevent all sorts of objections from the advocate of the faith, accusing De La Salle of heresy and so on. Reyes, the French author that Luke referred to this morning, who more or less stimulated the Institute to get looking into the work of De La Salle, said that this was an unfortunate mistake, in particular in regards to the meditations. At one time, the brothers figured that the meditations weren't by De La Salle, and they began manipulating the meditations. And we people in America did not have a true copy of the Meditations of De La Salle until Battersby published his work in 1953. We were reading annotated and modified copies of the Meditations because at one point in the middle of the 19th century, I may not be right in the exact time, but at one time the Superior General changed it and improved on the Meditations and found it. Incidentally, we know of letters that were written by De La Salle which we don't have. He wrote letters to Sister Louise, by the way, and Luke has brought up the question of how come, since she's not supposed to have been able to read or write. But Blaine says that he wrote to Sister Louise, encouraging her to raise her voice in protest against the appellants, of which Luke said he might have been one of them in the case of the Holy See condemnation of Jansenism, or at least of some aspects of Jansenism. He also wrote letters to ex-brothers, and that Blaine brings that out. I don't think you'll get it in the first 3 volumes, but in Book 4, speaking about the eminent charity of De La Salle, there's an account of a brother who left the monks. He had apparently experienced De La Salle in an ecstatic moment and was so frightened that he decided to quit. And he married, and he had a lot of trouble. His wife got sick, and the children grew up crooked or whatever. And he himself reported all this and showed the letters to his bishop, or to his director, his spiritual director. And Blaine mentions that. So there are a lot of letters And I imagine a lot of legal transactions and legal letters that have been lost too, that may still be found. Another book that I'm supposed to write is on De La Salle in financial administration. If I live that long, and if I keep my wits and my eyesight, but that's part of the master plan. Luke was supposed to write 4 of them. He's written 2 of them already, and I have the other 2, and I haven't started them yet. But you may end up doing one of those, or both.
I only did one. I have one yet to go. I have.
They're called the thematic books.
It's on my back burner.
His formative years, which has come out, and his family, both ancestral and subsequent, I understand. And you're working at both ends of his family.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm supposed to write on the early brothers that Luke assigned me these, and on his management of financial things. I think that's a fascinating thing. Loes has published one whole volume of legal documents that De La Salle was involved with in the administration of the Institute, and he has another equal volume coming out. And he's an amazing man, as Luke said. In volume 42, he gives references to volume 43, which has not been published yet, in the footnotes. See volume 43. He must be an extraordinarily organized personality. But how do I get off on that? Anyway, down at the bottom of the page, well, even before we get to the bottom, how many letters have been lost? Battersby estimates 18,000. Gallego estimates 7,000. Felix Paul, who is the marvelous man who did this circular for Athanase Emile, which is just the letters. There's no notes. Although at the back, there's an excellent, I put some summary of that into the English, 2 excellent appendices. And then he died before he could publish the critical edition with all his notes. And Georges Rigaud published this after Felix Paul had died. And I want to read a tribute to Felix Paul that Rigaud wrote in the introduction to the critical edition. His family name was Paul Van Damme, V-A-N-D-A-M-M-E. He was a distinguished person with a lively intelligence, a noble and sensitive soul, in sum, an excellent Lasallian, fit to understand and express clearly the thought of the saintly founder as well as observe faithfully the rule of his institute. He was a man of intense work, a precise and meticulous scholar, a diligent assistant editor of the Institute Bulletin, who manifested a remarkable skill and a wonderful success in the research, identification, and interpretation of old manuscripts and the writings of former years. At the time of the publication of Circular 335 in 1952, he had already completed the immense compilation of his final work on the letters. His detailed commentary on each letter was ready to be added to the presentation of the entire collection which appeared in the circular. The various writings were once again subjected to a thorough re-examination. The text itself was carefully verified. The explanations and references of every sort were put in place. Notes about the recipients of the letters, the occasion prompting each letter, the problems of dating each letter, the determination of place, meaning of the unfamiliar terms, the inclusion of historical facts about the Institute, the reign of Louis XIV, the minority of Louis XV, and the papacy at the beginning of the 18th century. The English translation and notes were done on the basis of that critical edition by Brother Coleman Loes, who unfortunately died before the book could be published. He died either in 84 or 85. It's an unfortunate thing that in our editing of this, we didn't make mention of the fact that Coleman Loes, the translator, had died before it was published. I don't know how that happened. Coleman Loes wrote the introduction himself, and the publication had not gone that far that we could not have introduced that. Coleman Malloy, died rather suddenly when he and his brother Amity Malloy, who was still living in Australia, were on vacation in New Zealand, I believe. And we had to make a number of significant changes subsequently, which was regrettable too, that we could not do that in conjunction with Brother Coleman Malloy. I've listed there the published edition of the letters. I've also given you a page on the number of letters. It's you can read this over by yourself. It's too tedious and complicated, but I sat down and tried to figure out, on the basis of certain facts, how many letters De La Salle wrote. And I gave you a sheet with, for example, the list of all the schools that, look at that other sheet there, schools established by De La Salle. That in itself is something that I don't think we pay enough attention to. From 1679 to 1711, that's 11 and 21, 32 years. De La Salle established probably more than 56 schools. That's keeping pretty busy. And when you try to figure out when these schools began and how many brothers were needed in the schools, you get an idea of how many brothers De La Salle would have occasion to write to over the course of the years. I gave you another sheet which indicates how many brothers were actually in the Institute in 1717 when Brother Bartholomew went around. We have, we don't have a copy of that here, but you have a copy of that showing, oh yes, I guess it's in the last sheet now, some interesting data. Communities visited by Bartholomew in 1760. There we have an exact number of how many brothers were in these different schools, these 22 different places at the end of De La Salle's life. And it's on the basis of facts like that, I think, you can extrapolate how many letters De La Salle could have written. Another fact, in 1705, which would be about 14 years after De La Salle began this idea of writing letters, the rule of 1705 realized that maybe there was just too much letter writing demanded of the founder, so this is in the rule. If it happens that one or several houses are too distant from the residence of the superior of the Institute to be able to write every month, meaning for him to write back to, he will assign a director of one of the houses nearby to whom all the brothers of these distant houses will write every month. On the condition, however, that all the brothers of these houses will write at least twice a year, every 6 months, to the superior of the Institute, giving their account of the 6 previous months, repeating what they had written to the director assigned and what the director had written them, particularly the advice he gave them. Tight-knit organization, but it shows that De La Salle was not writing to every brother every month. I think that Battersby didn't take all that into consideration. And he figured, well, there are all these brothers and he's writing every month. That's got to be 18,000 letters. My little effort to do such kind of a study, I think at the bottom of the page, I go a little further than Felix Paul, who estimates 2,000 to 3,000. What did I come up with?
4.5.
On 4,000?
4.5.
Okay, trying to be very disciplined tonight. skipped over a few things. I may get a chance to throw at you there. That last page, some interesting data. Thought you'd be interested in knowing it. Here's another interesting bit of data. I have another minute. About the longevity of the brothers. In the 7 or 8 years, from 1681 to 1688, when De La Salle left Reims to go to establish schools in Paris, he lost 6 of the 15 brothers who composed the Institute at its beginning in the schools of Reims, Laon, Guise, and Rethel. All these men died a premature death before reaching the age of 30. There were others whose health was ruined and who had to seek help outside the community. From 1688 up to De La Salle's own death in 1719, he had to deplore the demise of at least 45 more brothers. Of these, only 8 or 9 were over 30 years of age. Any questions?
Where you get that last quote you just said there?
From Blaine. Look at this at your leisure. Look at this at your leisure. Respect both of them and leave them here, please. No questions. Okay.
Letters to Bartholomew. You said in 1717, I guess. De La Salle stopped writing letters to the brothers.
Well, I think the last letter we have is written in 1711.
Do we have letters? What about Bartholomew and his letters?
We have letters. Yes. In that case, which you'll see there, but I don't have Bartholomew's. We do have, I've seen some letters, I've made photocopies of some of Bartholomew's letters. And there will be at least one in the English edition. But in this shelf there are 10 cases of Brother Solomon's letters. 2 are St. Benil's document. And such things as the Memoir on the Habit. And as Luke said this morning, there is a copybook with the 13 final vows of 1694 by the 12 brothers and De La Salle. Actually, look at that. It's an unbelievable experience. You wanted 5 minutes.
Thanks, guys.